On August 13, 1944, General George S. Patton stood inside his Third Army headquarters, his eyes fixed on a large map of Normandy spread across the wall. To most observers, the map was a chaotic mess of lines, arrows, and symbols. To Patton, it was a living battlefield, revealing the flow of armies, the collapse of defenses, and the fleeting opportunities that appear only once in a generation. What he saw in those markings filled him with a mix of urgency and frustration. After weeks of brutal fighting following the D-Day landings, the balance in Western Europe was finally shifting. The German army in France was no longer advancing or even holding firm, it was breaking apart. Entire German divisions were retreating in confusion, their supply lines shattered by relentless Allied air attacks and constant pressure on the ground. Roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles, artillery pieces, and exhausted soldiers trying desperately to escape west and east. The once feared German command structure was struggling to regain control, issuing orders that arrived too late or not at all. For the first time since the invasion began, Allied commanders could sense that victory in France was not just possible, but close if they acted decisively. At the center of Patton's attention was a narrow gap between the towns of Argentan and Falaise. On the map, it looked almost insignificant, a slim corridor barely 15 miles wide. On the battlefield, however, it represented something far greater. If American forces surged north from Argentan while British and Canadian units drove south from Falaise, the two pincers could snap shut around the bulk of the German forces still fighting in Normandy. More than 100,000 enemy soldiers, along with their tanks, artillery, and remaining supplies, could be trapped in a massive pocket with no escape. Such opportunities were rare in modern warfare. This was the kind of encirclement taught in military academies, studied in history books, and dreamed of by commanders who understood its consequences. Destroying such a large force could shorten the war dramatically, breaking Germany's ability to defend France and opening the road to Paris and beyond. Patton, known for his aggressive instincts and belief in relentless pursuit, understood exactly what was at stake. His armored divisions were ready. His commanders were eager. The enemy was vulnerable. The moment was slipping away with every passing hour. Then, just as the path to a decisive victory seemed clear, Patton received an order from above, an order that brought his advance to a sudden and controversial halt. Patton's Third Army had been unleashed with explosive force following the success of Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from the Normandy hedgerows in late July 1944. For weeks, American troops had fought yard by yard through dense bocage country, paying a heavy price for every mile. Cobra changed everything. Once the German front shattered, Patton's army surged forward like a released spring, moving with a speed and aggression that stunned both the enemy and Allied commanders alike. In a matter of days, the Third Army transformed from a newly activated force into the most dynamic striking arm in Western Europe. Armored columns raced across the French countryside, often advancing faster than maps could be updated. Town after town fell with little resistance as German units, already weakened by months of combat and relentless Allied air power, failed to establish coherent defensive lines. Patton's doctrine was simple and ruthless: keep moving, exploit confusion, and never give the enemy time to regroup. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and stretched supply lines slowed the advance, but not enough to stop it. The momentum was undeniable. By August 13th, American forces had captured the town of Argentan, a key position at the southern edge of what would soon become known as the Falaise Pocket. The fighting there had been surprisingly light. Instead of the fierce counterattacks Patton expected, German resistance was scattered and disorganized. Many enemy units were already pulling back in haste, abandoning heavy equipment and leaving rearguards that melted away under pressure. To Patton, Argentan felt less like the end of an advance, and more like the doorway to a decisive victory. Reports from reconnaissance units confirmed his instincts. Patrols pushing north toward Falaise encountered only thin defensive screens, small groups of infantry, a few anti-tank guns, and hastily organized roadblocks. These were not the defenses of an army preparing to stand and fight. They were the desperate measures of a force trying to delay the inevitable. Behind these fragile lines, German troops inside the forming pocket were in dire condition. Weeks of combat had left them exhausted, demoralized, and dangerously short of fuel and ammunition. The roads told the story clearly. Allied pilots and forward observers described columns of German vehicles stretching for miles, jammed bumper to bumper along narrow country lanes. Tanks sat idle for lack of fuel. Trucks were abandoned where they broke down, pushed into ditches to clear the way for those behind. Horse-drawn wagons moved alongside motorized units, a stark reminder of how strained German logistics had become. Overhead, Allied fighter bombers attacked relentlessly, turning roads into killing zones and spreading panic among the retreating troops. Patton understood the significance of these reports immediately. This was not an organized withdrawal. It was a collapse in slow motion. The German army in Normandy was trying to escape before the trap closed, but time was running out. The gap between Argentan and Falaise remained open but barely. Every hour that passed increased the risk that German forces might slip through, regroup, and establish new defensive lines deeper inside France. From a purely operational standpoint, the opportunity was extraordinary. Patton's armored divisions were built for exactly this kind of mission. His tanks could cover the distance to Falaise in a matter of hours, especially against light opposition. Even if they encountered resistance, Patton believed the gap could be sealed within a day or two. Once closed, the result would be catastrophic for the Germans. An entire army group, men, machines, and command structures could be destroyed in one decisive blow. Such chances were rare, even in a global war. Most campaigns were wars of attrition, grinding advances measured in miles and weeks. What lay before Patton was different, a fleeting moment where speed, aggression, and timing could change the course of the entire campaign in Western Europe. He knew that if the German forces in Normandy were annihilated, there would be little left to stop the Allies from racing toward Paris and the German border. The war in France could be shortened by months. Patton also understood the psychological impact. A successful encirclement at Falaise would not only destroy German combat power, but shatter morale at every level. Commanders would lose faith in their ability to control the battlefield. Soldiers would lose hope of holding France. For the Allies, it would validate the strategy of relentless pursuit and bold maneuver that Patton had championed throughout his career, standing at Argentan. With his forces poised to strike north, Patton believed he was witnessing one of those rare alignments of opportunity and capability. The enemy was vulnerable in a way it would never be again. The terrain favored rapid movement. The weather allowed constant air support. His troops were confident, experienced, and eager to press on. All the elements required for a decisive encirclement were in place. What remained was a single, critical decision: whether the advance would continue without hesitation, or whether the moment would be allowed to slip away. That same day, as Patton weighed the opportunity unfolding before him, a conversation took place that would alter the course of the Normandy campaign. Patton spoke directly with General Omar Bradley, the commander of the American 12th Army Group and his immediate superior. Bradley had followed Third Army's rapid advance with admiration, but also with growing concern. When the subject turned to Argentan and the road north toward Falaise, Bradley's message was unambiguous. The advance would stop. Third Army was to hold its positions at Argentan and go no farther. The order came as a shock to Patton. From his perspective, the enemy was collapsing in plain sight. German forces were disorganized, retreating, and exposed. His tanks were ready, his commanders eager, and the distance to Falaise tantalizingly short. Yet Bradley's decision had little to do with German resistance or the capabilities of Third Army. Instead, it revolved around lines drawn on a map, lines that represented command boundaries, coordination agreements, and the fragile structure of the Allied coalition. The boundary between American and British command zones ran directly through the narrow gap between Argentan and Falaise. On paper, it was a neat administrative division. On the battlefield, it cut straight through one of the most critical opportunities of the war. Advancing beyond that line would place American forces into an area officially assigned to British and Canadian troops. Advancing south under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's command, Bradley feared that such a move could lead to chaos. Allied armies were fighting in close proximity, often separated by only a few miles. Communications were imperfect, and battlefield awareness was limited by terrain, smoke, and the sheer speed of the advance. American and British units used different radio frequencies, different call signs, and different operational procedures. In the confusion of fast-moving armored warfare, there was a real risk that friendly units could mistake one another for the enemy. A single misidentified column or airstrike could lead to catastrophic friendly fire incidents. These concerns were not hypothetical. Earlier in the campaign, Allied aircraft had mistakenly attacked friendly troops, and ground units had occasionally fired on one another in the fog of war. Bradley, responsible for the lives of tens of thousands of American soldiers, was unwilling to gamble on perfect coordination in such a volatile situation. To him, maintaining clear boundaries and controlled advances was the safer course, even if it meant delaying or forfeiting a potential encirclement. Yet the reasons went deeper than tactical caution. Beneath the surface lay the political realities of coalition warfare. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was not subordinate to Bradley. He commanded British and Canadian forces as an equal partner within the Allied command structure. The boundaries between their armies were not merely operational guidelines. They were the result of negotiations conducted at the highest levels involving generals, politicians, and heads of state. These agreements were designed to preserve trust and cooperation among allies with different priorities, doctrines, and national interests. For American forces to cross into Montgomery's sector without explicit coordination or approval would be seen as more than a battlefield decision. It would be perceived as a breach of trust, an assertion of dominance, and an insult to British command authority. Such an action risked inflaming already sensitive rivalries among Allied leaders. Personal tensions between commanders were well known, and while they were kept in check by the shared goal of defeating Germany, they had not disappeared. Bradley understood this delicate balance. As an American commander, he was keenly aware that Allied unity was as important as battlefield success. The coalition fighting in Western Europe depended on cooperation, mutual respect, and adherence to agreed-upon plans. A dramatic unilateral move by Patton, even one that promised decisive results, could undermine that unity. In the worst case, it could lead to political fallout that extended far beyond the battlefield, complicating future operations and damaging relationships that had taken years to build. Patton, for his part, was furious. To him, the halt order represented everything he despised about cautious, bureaucratic warfare. He believed wars were won by seizing opportunities, not by respecting artificial lines drawn far from the front. He argued that boundaries could be adjusted, coordination established after the fact, and risks managed through speed and clarity of intent. The enemy, he believed, would not wait while Allied commanders debated protocol, yet Patton was also a professional soldier who understood the chain of command. Despite his reputation for defiance and outspoken criticism, he knew when an order was final. Bradley's directive left no room for interpretation. The Third Army would stop at Argentan. There would be no push north, no dash to Falaise, no attempt to close the gap from the American side. Reluctantly, Patton complied. His tanks halted. His spearheads dug in. The momentum that had carried Third Army across France slowed to a standstill at the very moment when speed mattered most. Patton later wrote and spoke bitterly about the decision, convinced that a historic opportunity had been lost. To him, the halt order was not merely a pause, it was the difference between destroying the German army outright and allowing a significant portion of it to escape. Bradley, however, believed he had made the responsible choice. He had preserved command discipline, avoided the risk of friendly fire, and maintained the political cohesion of the Allied alliance. In the short term, the line held. In the long term, the consequences of that decision would be debated by historians. Soldiers and commanders for decades dotted Argentan. The war paused not because the enemy had stopped fighting, but because Allied command lines, politics, and caution had intervened. The gap remained open, the moment slipped away, and the outcome of the Falaise encirclement would be decided under far different circumstances than Patton had envisioned. South of Falaise, the advance of Patton's Third Army came to an unnatural halt. American tanks that only days earlier had thundered across France now sat silent. Their engines shut down and their guns pointed uselessly toward the north. Crews climbed out of their vehicles, stretching stiff legs and wiping grime from their faces, trying to make sense of the sudden pause. Ahead of them, artillery thunder echoed across the countryside, and columns of black smoke rose on the horizon, marking ongoing battles just beyond their reach. Every sound and sight confirmed what the men already knew: the Germans were retreating, and the road north was still open. The frustration was palpable. Tank commanders studied maps and binoculars, watching distant movement and listening to radio chatter that hinted at chaos among the enemy. Reconnaissance reports continued to arrive, describing German columns streaming east, desperately trying to escape the closing jaws of the Allied advance. To the soldiers on the ground, the situation seemed painfully clear. A short drive north could cut off the retreat and end the fight. Instead, orders were orders, and Third Army remained where it was, while American forces waited south of the Gap. Responsibility for sealing the encirclement fell to the British and Canadian armies advancing from the north. Their task was no less difficult, but their approach reflected a different philosophy of warfare. Rather than rapid exploitation, their commanders favored deliberate, methodical advances designed to minimize risk and consolidate gains. This style had served them well in earlier battles, but in the fluid situation around Falaise, time was the most precious commodity. German units, though battered and demoralized, were still capable of disciplined resistance. As British and Canadian forces pushed south, they encountered determined rearguard actions designed to slow the advance at every step. Small groups of German infantry, supported by anti-tank guns and the occasional remaining armored vehicle, fought stubbornly from prepared positions. Hedgerows, sunken roads, and villages turned into strong points, forcing the attackers to clear each obstacle one by one. The terrain favored the defenders. Normandy's countryside, with its narrow lanes and dense vegetation, limited visibility and restricted armored movement. German troops used these features expertly, withdrawing just before being overwhelmed and then establishing new defensive lines a short distance to the rear. Each withdrawal bought precious time for the main body of the army to escape eastward through the still open corridor. As a result, progress was agonizingly slow. Gains were measured not in miles, but in hundreds of meters per day. Every village captured came at a cost, and every pause to reorganize or resupply allowed more German soldiers to slip through the gap. From Patton's perspective, watching from the south, it was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. The jaws of the trap were closing, but far too slowly to guarantee decisive results. For 8 critical days, the corridor east of Falaise remained open. It was narrow, constantly under attack, and increasingly deadly, but it was open. Through it poured thousands of German soldiers, many of them wounded, exhausted, and shaken. Units lost all cohesion as officers struggled to maintain order amid the chaos. Heavy equipment was abandoned by the roadside, tanks without fuel, artillery pieces with no tractors to move them, trucks destroyed by air attacks or simply left behind. Allied air power turned the escape routes into scenes of devastation. Fighter bombers prowled overhead from dawn to dusk, attacking anything that moved. Roads became littered with burning vehicles, shattered wagons, and the bodies of men and animals alike. Horses, still widely used by the German army, lay dead in tangled heaps, their carts smashed by strafing runs. Survivors fled into fields and forests, moving only at night. Driven by the fear of aircraft as much as by the advancing Allied armies, the losses were horrific, and the psychological impact was immense. Many German soldiers later described the retreat from Normandy as one of the most terrifying experiences of the war. Yet despite the destruction, enough men made it through to matter. Tens of thousands escaped the pocket, stripped of much of their equipment but still alive, still capable of fighting another day. When the gap finally closed near the end of August, the battlefield inside the Falaise pocket was a vision of ruin. The Allies had achieved a significant victory, destroying vast quantities of German materiel and killing or capturing large numbers of troops. But the victory was incomplete. The German army in Normandy had been badly mauled, not annihilated. Those who escaped would form the backbone of Germany's defenses in the months to come. They would fight again in the forests of the Ardennes on the Siegfried Line and inside Germany itself. The war in Western Europe would continue for many more bitter months, costing countless additional lives for Patton and many of his officers. The days spent waiting south of Falaise remained a source of deep frustration. They believed that history had offered a rare chance for a decisive blow, and that hesitation, boundaries, and caution had allowed the enemy to slip away. Standing beside silent tanks and watching smoke drift across the horizon, they felt they were witnessing not just the escape of a beaten army, but the loss of a moment that might never come again. When the encirclement around Falaise finally closed in late August 1944, the battlefield told two very different stories at once. On the one hand, the scale of German destruction was undeniable. Tens of thousands of enemy soldiers lay dead or had been taken prisoner. The roads inside the pocket were choked with smashed tanks, wrecked artillery, and burned-out vehicles abandoned in desperate flight. Entire divisions had ceased to exist as organized formations. From a purely numerical standpoint, it was one of the greatest Allied victories of the war in Western Europe. Yet, alongside that triumph stood a troubling reality. Tens of thousands of German soldiers had escaped through the gap before it closed. Many of them were not raw recruits or poorly trained units. They were experienced veterans, men hardened by years of fighting on multiple fronts, drawn from the Leibpanzer and Waffen-SS divisions. These soldiers represented the core of Germany's remaining combat power in the West. They had lost much of their equipment, but not their discipline, experience, or will to fight. Once across the Seine, these survivors began to regroup. German command, though shaken, moved quickly to reconstitute battered units, merging remnants of divisions and issuing new equipment as it became available. Defensive lines were established along rivers, forests, and fortified positions that favored delay and attrition. The Allies advanced rapidly across France, liberating Paris and pushing toward the German border. But they increasingly encountered resistance from the same veteran formations that had escaped Normandy. By autumn, many of these units had taken up positions along the Siegfried Line, Germany's formidable belt of fortifications guarding the western frontier. There the war slowed once again. Concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, minefields, and prepared kill zones blunted Allied momentum. American, British, and Canadian troops now faced a more organized, determined enemy, one that had survived the catastrophe in Normandy and learned painful lessons from it. 4 months after the Falaise pocket, the long shadow of that escape fell fully across the battlefield. In December 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, an area the Allies believed to be weakly defended. The attack, which became known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Germany's last major gamble in the West. It aimed to split Allied armies, capture vital supply ports, and force a negotiated peace. At the heart of that offensive were divisions rebuilt around the men who had escaped from Normandy. Though short on fuel and supplies, they were led by experienced officers and manned by veterans who knew how to fight under extreme conditions. These were the same soldiers who had slipped through the gap east of Falaise, men who understood Allied tactics, had survived constant air attacks, and had learned how to exploit terrain and weather to offset their disadvantages. The result was the bloodiest battle fought by American forces in Europe. The surprise was nearly complete. Snow, fog, and poor weather grounded Allied aircraft and robbed them of their greatest advantage. German units smashed into thin American lines, surrounding entire regiments and driving deep salients into Allied territory. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of desperate resistance, with surrounded troops holding out against repeated attacks in freezing conditions. By the time the battle ended in January 1945, American forces had suffered over 19,000 killed and more than 80,000 total casualties. Thousands more were wounded, captured, or listed as missing. The human cost was staggering and the psychological toll profound. While the Allies ultimately prevailed, the price paid was far higher than it might have been had the German army in Normandy been completely destroyed months earlier. George Patton recognized the connection immediately. To him, the Battle of the Bulge was not an isolated event, but a consequence of decisions made the previous summer. As his Third Army executed its dramatic pivot north to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, Patton encountered familiar enemy units. Intelligence reports and battlefield encounters revealed that many of the German formations opposing him had fought in Normandy. Their officers and non-commissioned officers were veterans of the same campaign Patton had tried to end decisively. Patton's reaction was bitter and deeply personal. He believed that the opportunity lost at Argentan and Falaise had come due with interest. In his writings and conversations, he expressed the view that thousands of American lives were now being sacrificed because a chance to annihilate the enemy had not been taken when it was available. To Patton, the war had demanded boldness, and caution had exacted a terrible price. Historians would later debate how decisive the closure of the Falaise pocket truly was and whether the complete destruction of German forces there was ever realistically possible. But for Patton, the issue was clear. The gap had allowed an enemy to escape, regroup, and strike again. The long shadow of that moment stretched from the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. In the end, Germany would still be defeated, and the Allies would still march into the heart of the Reich, but the road to victory was longer and bloodier than it might have been. And in Patton's mind, every fallen American in the Ardennes stood as a silent reminder of the gap that had once been left open, and the opportunity that had slipped away. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the debate over what had happened at Argentan and Falaise did not end. In many ways, it had only begun. Wartime decisions made under pressure were now examined in the cold light of hindsight, with maps spread across desks instead of battlefield walls. Among the most controversial of those decisions was the order that halted Patton's Third Army south of Falaise at the very moment when a decisive encirclement seemed within reach. General Omar Bradley, who had issued the halt order, spent much of his post-war life defending his actions, at least publicly. In memoirs, interviews, and official histories, he consistently emphasized the dangers of friendly fire and command confusion. Allied armies, he argued, were advancing rapidly in close proximity, using different communication systems and procedures. A premature thrust across command boundaries could have resulted in American and British forces firing on one another, an outcome that would have been both militarily disastrous and politically explosive, yet behind closed doors. Bradley's tone was more reflective. In private conversations and later writings, he acknowledged that stopping Patton at Argentan had probably been a mistake. The German army in Normandy, he admitted, had been closer to total collapse than Allied commanders fully realized at the time. The chance to destroy it outright may have existed for only a brief window, and that window had closed while American forces waited. Bradley did not deny the opportunity had been lost. He only questioned whether, given what he knew at the time, he could have acted differently. That tension between what was known then and what became clear later lies at the heart of the historical debate. For decades, military historians have examined the Falaise pocket from every angle, replaying the movements of divisions, studying aerial photographs, and recalculating timelines. Some have argued that the gap could have been closed earlier, and that Patton's armored columns would have faced only scattered resistance. Others maintain that the situation was more complex, that German defenses were stronger than Patton believed, and that coordination between Allied armies was more fragile than it appeared. One school of thought defends Bradley's decision as an example of responsible coalition leadership. World War II was not fought by a single nation acting alone. It was a carefully balanced alliance of countries with different military cultures, political priorities, and command structures. Maintaining unity was essential. A serious breakdown in coordination between American and British forces could have undermined trust at the highest levels, complicating future operations and potentially slowing the overall Allied advance. From this perspective, restraint was not weakness, it was strategic discipline. Another school of thought sides with Patton. Its proponents argue that wars are won by seizing fleeting opportunities, not by adhering rigidly to plans drawn up far from the front. The situation at Argentan, they contend, was precisely the kind of moment that demanded bold action. The German army was reeling, Allied air superiority was overwhelming, and speed was the decisive factor. Even if risks existed, the potential reward, the destruction of a large portion of Germany's remaining forces in the West, was worth taking them. What makes the debate enduring is that both arguments contain truth. Coalition warfare does demand caution and coordination. At the same time, decisive moments rarely announce them clearly, and waiting for perfect conditions often means waiting too long. The commanders involved were not choosing between right and wrong, but between competing risks, each with consequences that could not be fully predicted. What cannot be debated, however, is the outcome. The failure to close the Falaise Gap completely did not lose the war. Germany was already strategically defeated, and the Allies possessed overwhelming industrial, manpower, and air power advantages. But the decision did extend the war. German forces that escaped Normandy continued to fight in France, on the German border, and in the Ardennes. Each additional month of resistance translated into more battles, more suffering, and more bloodshed. For the soldiers on the front lines, these debates were not academic. Every delay meant another winter in the field, another river crossing under fire, another assault against fortified positions. It meant more telegrams delivered to homes across America, Britain, Canada, and Europe, messages that informed families their sons, husbands, or brothers would not be coming home. Those costs were paid not in theory, but in lives. In the end, the story of Argentan and Falaise stands as a reminder of the weight carried by commanders in war. Decisions made in hours can shape events for months. Lines drawn on maps can determine who lives and who dies. Patton believed that boldness could have ended the campaign sooner. Bradley believed that caution preserved the alliance that made victory possible. History records that victory was achieved, but not without a price. The judgment after the war, like the war itself, offers no simple answers. It offers only lessons, that opportunities in war are fleeting, that alliances are fragile, and that even the right decision at the time can leave a long shadow when the fighting is over. The Falaise Gap remains one of the most controversial decisions of the Second World War, a moment where military opportunity collided with political reality. Was caution justified, or did hesitation cost thousands of lives? If you want more in-depth, story-driven World War II analysis like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. History isn't just about what happened, it's about the decisions that shaped everything that followed.